How to set up your sales process. Hey guys, I'm Donnie Bovine, the CEO and founder of Success Champions Networking and the author of Endless Stream of Referrals 10 Ways to Get a Ton of Referrals Coming into Your Business. This is Growth Mode, where I hang out with Kevin Snow, the sales and automation genius, and we talk about all things sales, business development, and growing and scaling your business. In this episode, we're going to dive into specifically how do you build out your sales process? Kevin, where do we go from here, my friend?
So when I started Time on Target, and actually it was wasn't when I started Time on Target, it was when I came back from the deployment and I did the giant shift in my business from speaking to actually consulting. And I started reaching out to companies and getting, a sales meeting with them. I tried to replicate the same sales process I used when I was selling in the corporate world. A very structured, multi-step process. And it didn't work. And I failed miserably. I wasn't closing shit. And it was really because I hadn't figured out how my buyers, how my clients were making their decisions. I was trying to force them through my process of how I wanted to sell instead of selling to them how they wanted to buy and getting them the information in the right order at the right time to make their decision easy. And it took me a long time to figure that out.
Yeah, for sure. And, even for me, I came from Sandler training and I, learned a very particular way to sell through a kind of this step-by-step process. And what I found is is a very similar thing is the way I always sold wasn't going to work in this new world where now I was selling from the CEO perspective. And so I had to develop and figure out the entire process for me to actually go through and develop a system and a process for me to be able to sell. So I think a lot of it was and I think you experienced this as well, is we both kind of had to go through this moment of screwing shit up, and breaking what we thought was going to work to figure out how we could put things together and develop this process. And what I found for me, and I'm sure you found a very similar thing, is by building out my actual sales process now, I've gotten to this place where every sales call I have is almost the exact same call. There's very little variance in what's said and what's happened, and which makes it a lot easier to bring on a lot more lifelong clients.
Yeah, when I was selling originally, it was very much, all right, you have your initial call, you get all the information, you leave, you come back for another meeting and present the solution and go through all that, and then you talk about pricing. And it was this really long, drawn-out thing, and it was really hard to keep people engaged through that type of process because what I had didn't need that much breakup in the timeline. I now have it down where I do one call closes for digital marketing consulting. There's no, hey, let's get together in 2 weeks and let's talk more. It's really down to the same steps are there, but they're just all compressed. Now in my meeting, it's, information gathering and then teaching and giving tons of information and solutions. And hey, you could do this. Here's other things you can do. And it's almost giving them so much stuff that they're like, oh my God, I need to have him do it because I'll never be able to do this myself.
Yeah, for sure. And for me, it's also allowed me to quickly identify whether I want to work with an individual or not a lot faster. I'm disqualifying people a lot quicker because it's a lot easier to identify who you want to work with when you're very systematic in the approach, because their responses to their questions, and if you've done this enough times, you don't get these wild, just crazy questions or things that you've never heard before, because there's only the same questions that get asked on a regular basis. So based on how they're responding and interacting makes it really, really easy for me to determine if they're a good fit to work with. And it allows me to change up how I'm approaching the call. So, which has been a lot of fun. So I think, for a lot of this is, I mean, I'll speak for me. The entire idea of really selling through a step by step process felt so stoic to me. I mean, even before I learned the Sandler system, even before, uh, when I started this company, I was so hell bent on being just my authentic self and just showing up as me. I was really worried that if I tried to stay in the step by step process, that I would come across like a high C and be robotic as fuck, and nobody would want to do business with me. Um, so I shied away from it. But what I found is, even though I have a system and a process, it's not this boring ass, okay, they said this, you said this, they do this, you do this. It's a kind of a system that you're following through to completion.
Yeah, and I think people have that misconception about a process that once you have a process, you have scripts, you learn specific things you're supposed to say in order that you want to do them in, is that you have to follow that every time. It's going to be exactly the same thing every time you go on a sales call, and that's not true. The scripts and the process are there are to help you learn. And then, I always had scripts when I was telemarketing, and it was really so I could make sure I didn't stumble and didn't sound totally like I had no clue what I was talking about. But the more I learned the script, the easier it was to put it into my words and my intonation and my
Your what?
personality.
The hell's an
Intonation.
intonation?
It's how you
Intonation.
talk. Intonation. It's how you talk. It's
Somebody break out the fucking dictionary for me.
we have
Intonation.
a new segment on the show. Word of the week for Donnie.
I am Googling intuition right now.
Intonation.
Oh, intonation. Well, make people
You're
listen.
making up words.
So,
Intuition.
roll the tape, Greg. Put that back in there. What the fuck did he actually say? All right, continue on. Intonation.
But the process is there to help you learn how to move someone through that cycle as quickly as possible. And they are meant to be flexible because your client isn't going to stay in a linear decision making cycle. And a lot of people think, oh, we did this, so now we won't have to do that anymore. Well, they might learn something new and now they go back to an information gathering stage. It's not a straight line anymore. So you need to be able to get really good at, you understand the process, but you understand what the triggers are and what the signs are that someone is at a certain stage. So if they move backwards, you're able to recognize, okay, we are now back here because something happened, or they've jumped ahead and they're now thinking, how do I buy? What's the next steps?
Yeah. So the rise and fall of a voice in speaking. That is intonation. So, I mean, to that point is it goes back to what we've always said. Sales is a conversation, right?
Yep.
So when you look at that conversation as you're going from here to here to here to here, it allows for a lot more natural and easy flow of the conversation. And when they have that intonation, when their voice rises and falls and they get excited, um, or they get lethargic, in the call, the next move that you need to make to be able to continue that real conversation. And I think for me, by having these steps along the way, like, simple things, like when I, start a sales call, it, for me, every conversation is a sales call, right? So every conversation I start is going to start like this. Hey, Kevin, thanks for, sitting down. I got no agenda on this. Why don't we do this? You tell me your story. I'll tell you mine and we'll see what turns up. And I'm always going to make them go first. And the reason I found over the years to make them go first is however they share their story with me gives me a lot of ways to position myself to tell my story to see if I want to invest a further more sales conversation, more get to know you conversation, or where we're taking this conversation, in general. And it's just those little things about thinking about how do I start off the sales call? What's the big trigger questions I need to be asking? What needs to happen, at this point? to be able to continue the conversation moving forward.
So I'm going to ask you to expand on that a little bit because that actually ties in really good with the question we have this week from one of our members. Lauren Amon, from Lauren Amon Coaching from the Cincinnati Cattles chapter, asks, as a brand new business owner, what sales process steps should be considered, i.e., where do you start? So what steps do you need to have in your process?
Yeah, I
What do you
love
think
that.
is really important?
So each week we're going to be featuring a question from one of our Success Champion networking groups. We've asked them to submit a bunch of questions in. So it's a new fun segment we're adding in here, which I think will be a blast. So thanks, Lauren, for the question. I think, first and foremost is people need to start looking at their sales calls as a process in general, and start looking at different things to as far back as where did they find the individual? Where did the person first raise their hand, or where did the first connection get made with that person? So for me, I've always called it the first touch. What's the first touch you have with an individual? And that's the first stage of your sales process. So how did you meet them? Where did they come from? Was it an introduction? Was it a referral? Was it marketing? Was it an email? Was it an outreach? Where did you find them? And then from there, you start going through and you think about, the different things. So one of the things that I love to tell people to do is to break down your last 5 to 10 sales calls and go, okay, when you break down each one of those sales calls step by step, what were some of the things that popped up? How did you start the sales call? What did you say? What are some of the questions you asked along the way? And, what were some of the things that were either stumbling blocks for you, tripped you up, or made you pause to re-ask your question a different way? Where did you find yourself leaning into the conversation? Where did you see them leaning into the conversation? And you think step by step by step, where do I need to go? So you need to be looking at the different things like, what are the parameters for somebody to say yes to you that you need? They need to be able to make a decision. They need to have money. They need to have an actual problem you can solve, those type of things. But you start going through and start developing, okay, how do I uncover those problems? How do I figure out what product or service I should offer them? How do I figure out, how to get them to lean into the conversation and put the system to that?
I think that's really hard for a lot of business owners to do. I know when
Only
I
if they're
would.
not selling.
Well, no, I think well, let me rephrase that. I think the hard part for them is realizing what they said and what they're doing in their sales calls. Because I'd ask lots of my consulting clients, and that's one of the things. What's the one thing you say that makes everyone's the lights go on in your customers' eyes, or they just get it and they understand what you're talking about? And most of them had to think. They're like, "Oh, I don't know," and I think it's partially because if you get the win and you get the person to say, yes, I want to give you money, then you're all, woo, I got money. And you're excited and you move on. You're not thinking about how you got to that point. And if people say, no, I don't want to do business with you, you're like, screw it. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to move on to the next one. And they also don't figure out why the person said no. I think they move very much from the result onto the next thing without any consideration about what actually happened.
So then I'm going to put this back on you because I'm going to use a phrase that his eyes are going to light up as soon as I say this. How do they do an after action report after every sales call?
That's hard. I don't know. What
do you mean you don't know?
great answer. I think it's, and this will be really hard for you. Part of it is a CRM and being able to go back and look at what your notes were from that working with that client and seeing and trying to figure out patterns in ones that say no. Are there certain things happening that are causing them all to say no? And same thing with the ones that say yes. What are you doing differently between the yeses and the nos so that you get more yeses? And that's really.
So I'm gonna put a little bit more meat on this bone. Just I don't know. I can't believe those words came out of your mouth. So here, after every sales call, guys, you should literally take 5 to 10 minutes and break down that sales call. Okay. And you should, why it's absolutely fresh in your head. You should write out everything that you can remember. And you can do a CRM, that's totally fine, like Kevin says, but you should absolutely at least write it down on a sheet of paper and go through it. Okay, how did I start the sales call? What questions did I ask? What were their responses? And literally go line by line for the entire sales call. And I promise if you do this after every sales call, what you're going to start seeing is there's some consistencies in what you're saying and what you're doing and how you're responding and how you're asking. And that's going to form your overall sales process. He's chomping at the bit to say something because I made fun of him. So go ahead.
No, that's not why it was all. I think that's really. I agree. That's exactly what you need to do. Is you need to be after each event going through and saying, "All right, so what just happened?" and figuring that out. But I think as business owners, look at our schedule today. We're back to back to back to back, and that's really hard. So, what is the easy way for a business owner to be able to do that consistently?
To never finish a day without going back and revamping every meeting. I mean, I don't care how fucking melted you are at the end of the day. Before you turn off your computer, before you walk away from everything, you need to go back and break down every sales call. If you don't have a process, if you don't have a systematic way of selling, then you need to make sure every end of the day you do not finish up shop. And dude, we all get it. Kevin and I are fucking melted at the end of most days because of how hard we're running. He can last a lot longer than I am later into the night doing things, but dude, by 5 o'clock, I'm fucking toast. And even I say that my sales process, my sales calls, they're all so the same freaking call done over and over and over again. I don't have to break them down anymore because I know that there's nothing anybody can say to me that I haven't heard before. And I think a lot of this is the volume of conversations that I have on a regular basis that I know whether somebody's going to say yes or no to me before they say yes or no, just because I've been in it enough. But you need to finish out every day with breaking down your sales calls and figure out what was said.
Well, I think you also have done the same type of sales process so long that in the meeting when you screwed something up.
Oh, for
Because
sure.
we've been on sales calls with prospective clients, and we get done with the call, you're like, well, I fucked this up,
Yep.
and you knew right away. So, and that's a thing about
But oftentimes, though,
understanding.
too, I will call myself in the middle of that meeting, right? If I say something that
Yep.
was wrong, I'm like, shit. Well, that was a dumb thing for me to say. Here's what I was trying to say. I don't have any problem calling myself out through the process, but it's every time that happens, is to remember what you said. What was the action you took? I always have a pad of paper sitting in front of me. Um, I do a lot of doodling, a lot of drawing, but I also take a shit ton of notes. Most of the times, my notes make no sense later on because I'm just writing shit down. But it's those little things of listening to the moves and the questions and the things that get said and how they're said that allows me to think about the system and process. The biggest thing I want people to think about when you're thinking about your sales system is what's the least amount of steps I can put in place so that I can test. So it could be as simple as, all right, how do I start to call? How do I uncover some sort of problems? How do I figure out what to offer them? How do I make the offer? And then how do I onboard and how do I work them up to referral, right? If you just go with that simple of a system, now you can figure out what happens in each stage of that system, right? Each process along the way. And when you find that, you can then go back and start testing. And that's the fun thing is for most people, I want you to create the simplest sales system for yourself that you possibly can. And then I want you to constantly test it and try different ways. I think the sales call itself should be the most boring conversation because it's the same conversation over and over and over again. And it should be such a volume of these conversations that you hear something said by somebody and it triggers an automatic response from you because you've heard it so many damn times.
that that concept of the sales call being the most boring conversation is gets some salespeople into trouble though. Because I know when I was doing the corporate sales thing and I was working with specific types of clients, a lot of time I got to the point where I thought I knew the answers, so I started skipping over specific questions and trying
That's
to
a
take
lazy
shortcuts.
salesperson. That's a
Yeah,
lazy salesperson.
yeah, it's saying, oh, I'm going to take a shortcut basically and try and get to the closing faster, and that's a trap that a lot of people fall into.
Well, I mean, look, guys, at the end of the day, your job is to go find somebody who doesn't know shit about you, let them understand about your product and service, and get them so fucking excited that they're ready to do business with you. When I say the conversation should be boring, I'm not saying you should be bored with the conversation. I'm saying it should be the same damn conversation that happens every freaking time. It should be the a very consistent flow with very few nuances in maybe quantities or volumes or hours or terms of how long you'll work together. But for most of you, you know what you sell, you know what your services are, you know what it takes, you know what it cost it, for most things. And if you haven't put in a consistency in those type of things, go find a way to put something consistent to it. And that way, when you can sit across from somebody, you have so many ways to help them say yes to your product and service that it makes it easy. This isn't about shortcutting the process. This is about you diving into somebody with that same guys we always talk about is how do I disqualify this individual? How do I determine if I want to work with them? And what's the things I need to understand so I can make that determination and thought process for it? And it's a mental change. And the only person who really wants to shortcut a sales call is a salesperson who works for somebody else. When you're a business
Yep.
owner, right, you're not trying to shortcut anything. You don't have time to be a lazy motherfucker on these sales calls because your time is so fucking relevant. Every conversation you have has to be $1 million conversation, and you treat it that way. So if you're trying to shortcut your own sales process as a business owner, you're cutting your fucking throat. You know.
I agree.
So, action steps. We're going to wrap up every episode from here on out with specific action steps that you should be taking to develop or go off of this topic that we talked about. So, action steps for you, Kevin. What are some of the things people need to be doing with their business to develop their sales process?
So you already touched on one of them. They need to be looking at their past sales calls. So if you're listening today, what you need to do is look at your last 5 sales conversations you had and break them down. How did you find this person? How did you start that meeting? What did they say? What did you say? And how did you end the meeting? Did you set up the next steps or did you leave it open is really key. And then figure out what are the 10 questions you need to ask during that sales conversation that gets you to the point where you can have a great conversation about how to move forward and how to get to that next step.
Yeah, and I would add in there that, the bottom line of all this is figuring out what is your consistent system that takes people from unknown to known to interested to client to lifelong client that wants to make introductions and referrals for you. So, and I think, guys, if you really start looking at your sales as what's my process, it'll be an absolute game changer for your business. So, as always, guys, if you got any value out of this episode, you got any knowledge, tips, tricks, things of value that work for you, do us a favor and tell 2 people about this podcast or this show if you're watching on YouTube, and help them subscribe. Make sure you're subscribed if you're on YouTube. Make sure you ring the bell so you get new episodes coming out every time they come out. And leave us a 5-star review wherever you're listening or watching to podcasts. Those reviews really help us get more awareness out there in the marketplace. So as always, guys, it's Donnie and Kevin with the Growth Mode Show. Love you, mean it. See you. Bye.